being shipmates in this in adventure and in our pursuit of keeping this icon of resiliency alive and well and sailing into the future. And I want to thank you for your membership in the Captain Circle, for your generous leadership there, and for your ongoing support. I'd also like to thank the sponsors for this evening. We've Beauport Financial Services, Daveport Financial Associates, and then through our board vice president, John Thompson, Ameriprise Financial Services as well. And I've been keen to hear Bill talk about Sable Island since he joined our board 2 years ago. It's a fabled location and looms large in the lore of Schoonerman and has for a long time. And it's earned its nickname, that's for sure. And then it's another wonderful little detail. It's that in joining adventure and helping to lead the way, Bill is coming full circle in a way, because as a younger man, he joined the Barkentine Regina Maris under the legendary Captain George Nichols. And Regina, as many of you remember, was birthed right next to, or one pier over from where adventure is right now. And glad you're part of the Captain Circle. I'm grateful for your membership. I'm especially grateful for the new members who've joined this year as part of our 2020 annual appeal, which is ongoing. And I hope you'll consider participating as we weather this particularly challenging time. And with that said, just like to raise a quick toast to adventure. And here's to adventure. Long may she sail.
Okay. No, he wants to meet me. Okay. Fine.
And I'd like to introduce John Jakes to introduce Bill in the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'm John Jakes, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's Captain Circle event. Thank you for being here. You're in for a treat. There's nothing like a real sailor telling stories, especially if they're true, which isn't often the case. Our speaker this evening, fellow Adventure Board member Bill Barton, is a real sailor. He's a North Shore native with a lifelong interest in sailing and history, and he has an extensive sailing resume. It varies from small racing dinghies to square-rigged ships, and from racing to cruising to sail training to exploration. I was fortunate enough to be part of his crew for the 2000 Bermuda race aboard his 36-foot sloop Tazarin. He's done the Bermuda race 5 times and has been actually on the race committee for that race. He headed up the safety inspection committee, and for the Centennial race in 2006, he was actually the race committee chairman. The greatest testament to his sailing prowess, however, is that he's accomplished enough cruiser to induce his wife, Annie, to leave the golf course during the summer to sail with him on the coast of Maine. That's quite a testament. I'm really looking forward to hearing Bill talk about his expeditions to Sable Island and how this relates to the Gloucester fishing schooners. And after Bill's talk, I will moderate the question and answer session. So with no further ado, Bill Barton.
Thank you, JJ. And if you'll all just give me one moment here, I am going to share my screen with all of you and get things rolling. I'll just also mention, if you want, in the upper right of your screen, you can select speaker only view if you like, and the faces will cover a little less of the screen, your choice. Anyways, I really appreciate all of you coming here this evening to join in this presentation. And tonight we're going to explore Sable Island. I've been there 4 times over the number of years. And so tonight we're going to go by sail to the graveyard of the Atlantic. If you don't know me, as JJ said, I do love to sail. I started sailing right here on the North Shore, first in small boats, and as Stefan mentioned, sometimes in larger ones, the 144-foot Barkentine Regina Maris. And The first time I passed Sable Island was on Regina heading from Gloucester up to Labrador back in 1977. No chance to go ashore, but to see the island from a distance. And part of what I've loved about sailing is the opportunity to see all kinds of different places, like Tenerife and the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, or Bermuda that JJ mentioned. Or I've also been sailing down in Cuba and off its south coast to the remote Gardens of the Queen. One of the places that I have really loved over the years has been the Canadian Maritimes. And that's where we're going to head tonight. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Sable Island, but it certainly was a place that was very well known in Gloucester, particularly in the past, but still today. And some evidence of that is the image you're seeing now, which actually comes from a magazine ad from 1967 for the Atlantic Insurance Companies. And even up until that time, Sable Island and the graveyard of the North Atlantic was being used in marketing materials. So tonight we're going to head there and explore the island. Sable Island, the name of it comes from French, sable, which means sand. And indeed, it is all sand. There's not a rock to be found on the island, from one tip to the other. And towards the end of the talk, I want to really connect Sable Island back to Gloucester. We're going to explore the island in a number of ways, but then come back to Gloucester. So the first time I went ashore at Sable was back in 1987. As you can see, I haven't aged a day. But back then, I was delivering a boat up to Newfoundland. And on the way, as we passed by Sable Island, it was certainly the best conditions I've ever seen there. For 3 days, there'd been no wind, and the island was surrounded by very calm water. And back then, they weren't really letting many people go on the island at all. And we were granted permission to go ashore for 1 hour, which we probably stretched into 2. Didn't see a soul, but I became even further intrigued with it and promised myself that I'd get back there someday. So most of the sailing I do these days is on my 36-foot sloop, Tazarin. And she's been a good platform for what have been archaeological expeditions to Sable Island. And to put those together, I've worked with my good friend Dan Finnemore, who's the Curator of Maritime Art and History at the Peabody Essex Museum. And starting back in 2010, we had put in a proposal to the Canadian government to do the first ever on-island archaeology. Our hope was to look for evidence of early settlement or shipwreck survivor camps. And it meant working with a variety of entities in Canada, from the federal government, provincial government, the Nova Scotia Museum as a partner where the items we collected on island would reside, and more recently, a partnership with Parks Canada. If you're not familiar with just where Sable Island is, this satellite view will help. In the center of the screen is Nova Scotia and the Bay of Fundy jutting up to the left of it, Cape Breton Island attached over on the right. But the place that we're headed this evening is Sable Island. And it's this little crescent in the lower right. It's some 180 miles southeast of Halifax, perched on the edge of the continental shelf above the abyssal plain. So that's where we're headed. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see the island's shape. It kind of looks like a sinister grin perched in the remote part of the North Atlantic. In terms of its size, it's bigger than you might think. It's about 2/3 the size of the island country of Bermuda. So it's pretty good sized. And it is sculpted by winds that form the dunes. Parts of it seem very arid and desert-like. Other areas feel much more lush and green. A few quick facts about the island, just to orient ourselves. This crescent of sand is about 21 miles long, tip to tip. Changes in length a little bit depending on storms and weather. It's temperate. That's because it's surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, so it never really gets too hot nor too cold in the winter. The winds are light in the summer and tends to be a little bit stormier in the winter months. It is foggy. More than a third of the days out of the year, Sable Island is encased in fog, and it's the foggiest place in the country. Doesn't get a lot of snow. Sometimes it's covered with 1 to 2 inches in the winter. It's about half covered in vegetation, which helps hold the island together. It's essentially uninhabited today, as you'll see, but in the past it had settlements. And it does have some of those freshwater ponds. Little background on the island, just to orient ourselves further. The people who were first encountering the island were Europeans, the Portuguese and the Spanish, on exploration voyages to the New World. And we actually know that in about 1550, a Portuguese explorer left some cattle on the island. The ploy there was that they could return to the crown back in Portugal and say, when you want to fund another expedition, go with us. We know where there's fresh meat that will prevent scurvy, and the local peoples won't have been able to take it. And back then, that was the only way they knew to fight scurvy. It was a French settlement that lasted 5 years under the Marquis de la Roche. 60 convicts were put on the island. After 5 years, there were 12 of them left. Short-lived. We also know that in the early era of the Mass Bay colony, that vessels were sailing from Salem to go up to Sable Island and hunt walrus for the ivory in their tusks and oil. And within a few decades, that subspecies of walrus was entirely exterminated, and they don't exist anymore. Another connection to the local area, and a curious one, is that the Reverend Andrew Lemercier of Boston wanted to help shipwreck sailors and established a small settlement on the island for about 15 years, starting in 1738. And if any of you are looking for another way to socially isolate during COVID, you might want to reply to his advertisement from the Boston paper. Any person or persons, single or married, that might incline upon a reasonable encouragement to go to the island Sables and there to live for 3 months, 1 year, or a longer time, may apply to Andrew Lemercier Jr., now living at his father's house in Winter Street, Boston. They may be informed by him of the nature of the said island and the advantageous terms offered to persons thus inclined. He didn't get a lot of takers, which is part of why it was short-lived. In the years after his settlement closes up, the wrecks continue on the island, and we begin to see some wreckers taking up residence on the island. These are people who built campsites there with the purpose of trying to loot wrecks that came ashore on the island to collect pieces of their cargo. By the 1790s, there are some stories reaching back to Nova Scotia suggesting that some of these wreckers may even be killing survivors so that they can take more cargoes. We don't really know if that was true, but certainly wreckers were working on the island. But with that news that they might be rather savage, the Nova Scotian government finally decides to do something. And starting in 1801 and lasting for a century and a half, there's what's called the Humane establishment on Sable Island. So now shipwrecked mariners can get a little bit of assistance. And the population at the Humane establishment starts out small, but grows to about 60 people at its peak. And they live there with their families. Some children were born on the island. And the whole purpose was to help the mariners. They did have boathouses built along the shores of the island. Inside were their surf boats that they used to rescue people off of ships from. And eventually lighthouses do get built on Sable, and none of them still stand today. All the lights are extinguished on the island, and the towers are gone from the old lighthouses. But because of those lighthouses and the work there, Sable Island is recognized as the birthplace of the Canadian Coast Guard. Another big event for the island is 1905, when one of the first Marconi wireless telegraph stations is built on the island. That's so that news from passing ships can come to Sable and then reach back to the mainland from Sable's station. By the 1950s, the wrecks have really tapered off, largely due to electronic navigation. And 1956, the Humane establishment, now under the management of the Coast Guard, is closed up. In the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of offshore oil exploration on the island. An aerial view, I'll zoom in on a piece of it there, but one of the test wells that was dug on the island. And that had a big impact on Sable for a short period of time. No production wells were ever created on island, but it is surrounded offshore by several drill rigs right now that are there for natural gas. So in 2013, when the Coast Guard is realizing that they have to worry more about drugs and border protection and things, the island is turned over to management by Parks Canada. And now they consider it the newest gem in their Parks Canada system, albeit probably the hardest one to visit. So back to our expeditions. We've been there, I've been there for the archaeological purposes in 2010, 2015, and I returned to the island in 2017. And we leave from Massachusetts, from right here at Cape Ann out of Manchester, and sail out around Cape Sable at the southern tip of Nova Scotia, and then on up into Halifax, where we usually collect the rest of the crew and make the voyage on out to Sable. As I said, we do it on Tazarin. She's been a great platform for these. We typically have 6 people on board. For the 360-mile run up to Halifax, I've been doing that double-handed with just one other friend on board, and usually have some good sailing. It tends to be off the wind a fair amount heading that direction in the summer. So you get some nice weather and hopefully make it there pretty quickly in 2.5 days or less. At Halifax, you begin running into the shipping in the fog off the busy port, but we make our way up in there, and our base of operations there has been the Royal Nova Scotia Yacht Squadron. So there, the rest of the crew meets up with us, and it's time to get back aboard and make the 180-mile run that takes about a day and a half to get out to Sable. Again, if we're lucky, we have some good weather and nice sailing. The last time I did this, it actually proved to be a dead to weather beat for 180 miles with wind that built up to 20, 25 knots. So it's kind of rough going. But there are people sailing around the clock on board. So some people always on deck, others below sleeping. Dan Finnemore always has to keep himself perked up by drinking coffee grounds. But I really enjoy offshore sailing with a good group of people with a shared interest. And another thing I love about the offshore sailing is you never know what kind of wildlife you're going to come across. We had this osprey. We were about 100 miles offshore. He was tired. Ospreys don't belong at sea. They're coastal birds. And he was desperate for a place to land. And he spent about 20 minutes trying to land on the top of the mast, but the motion was just too great for him to hang on. And we keep sailing down below as his talons keep shredding the wind instrument at the masthead. So finally, the frustrated osprey decides to come on down and join us in the cockpit and sails along with us for a few hours while he rests and takes off again. But good sailing, and if you're lucky, maybe some dolphins alongside or playing in the bow wave, and a breeze that keeps building as we get closer to Sable Island. So eventually you get to the island, and some of my visits I've arrived in daylight. The conditions can be nice or can be difficult, and you have to find a spot to anchor. Sable is an unusual anchorage. There are no bays or harbors or coves. It's one 20-mile long lee shore, and it's essentially like anchoring in a shallow part of the Atlantic. And in some conditions, it can be pretty bouncy, and the vessel rolls a lot at anchor with the bow almost dipping underwater. Sometimes we arrive at night. You can't see the island, but you hear the surf, and you're watching your instruments, trying to find a good spot to anchor. The charts don't mean a whole lot because the currents continually shift the sands. So we're just searching for a good place as close as we dare to the island, and get the anchor out, get ourselves secured, and settle in for the night. And with that, I'd like to shift and deal with a question that I get asked pretty frequently about Sable. which is why are there so many wrecks on Sable Island? And a few of the factors, the first one I'll mention is that if you look at the shipping routes from anywhere in Northern Europe all the way down to the Mediterranean, if you take a great circle route over to the Maritimes of Canada, over to Massachusetts to New York, your great circle route is going to take you pretty darn close to Sable Island, south of Nova Scotia. So factor number one is over the last 5 centuries, an awful lot of vessels have passed very close to Sable. Another problem in the past were cartographic errors by map makers. And I'll just mention one in this 1596 map of the world by Debray. I'll zoom in here in a moment on the upper right quadrant, which is the Northwest Atlantic. And if we zoom in, I'll give us a little quick orientation. That brownish triangle in the center, that's Newfoundland with Cape Race at the lower corner of it. And the pink to the left below it is Nova Scotia. But what's really interesting is out there you see 4 small islands spread east to west. There were never in the last 500 years 4 islands out there. It could be that different cartographers were moving the island left or right on their map because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal on a meridian that passed not too far to the east of Sable. We aren't sure, but nonetheless, you start to get a variety of islands. So map problems occur for a long time. Something that hasn't gone away has to do with ocean currents. And you have the Labrador current, very cold water that flows down from Labrador around Newfoundland and drawn into the Nova Scotian current. And then you also have the Gulf Stream, which flows up the eastern seaboard of the United States and flows along the continental shelf heading off towards Europe. And right between those 2 waters lies Sable Island. And whenever you have really warm, moist water, warm, moist air above the water, and it's flowing over cold water, you're going to get fog. And fog hampers navigation. You can't do celestial navigation without a horizon. You can't visually see the island if the fog grows too thick. Another factor is that most of Sable's not very high. The highest points are about 100 feet, but most of it is much lower. So it's very hard to see at daytime as you approach and very difficult at night. Storms have been a big factor. Here's a hurricane wheeling its way up the Atlantic. And if you look in the upper right of this, where I just put the red circle, you can make out, I'll zoom in briefly. There's the little crescent of Sable Island. And indeed, Sable Island gets more hurricanes than any other place in Canada. So the weather can be tough there. Something else is that the island may be 20 to 23 miles long, depending on the year you're looking at it. But off of either end of the island are sandbars that stretch out 10, 15, or even 20 miles. And that means that it's not just a 20-mile long hazard, it's about a 50-mile long hazard to navigation very close to those shipping routes. So the last factor brings us back to talk about Gloucester in a way. This is the earliest known representation of Sable Island. But to orient ourselves with this map a little bit from 1556, on the left is Nuova Francia, or New France, which is Nova Scotia. And over on the right is Terra Nuova, or Newfoundland. Obviously, the view of the world of the area back then had a lot of errors in it. But the most curious thing about this is what almost looks like a long sea snake that runs south of Nova Scotia and then curls up around Newfoundland. And plunk in the middle of that curious sea snake is a little square labeled Isla de la Reina, which is Sable Island. And curiously, it's actually the first representation that I've seen of the fishing banks. They had already realized that stretching from George's Bank all the way along the south coast of Nova Scotia and up to Newfoundland, there were shoal areas that fish liked. So if you're a fisherman, this is the place to go. And on a later map, you see them beginning to actually understand where the banks are, and Sandy Isle plunk in the middle of them. So if you're a fisherman, Sable Island lies right in the middle of where you want to be. So if you're going to bring Gloucester back some cod to put on the flakes, you're probably going to be dealing with Sable Island. Look at a few shipwrecks just kind of in general, very quickly. And as I do that, I'm going to start with a map produced by the Department of Education in Nova Scotia. And it endeavors to show the rough locations of known shipwrecks around Sable Island. I'm just going to let it scroll by and give you a sense of what it looks like. And I'll just turn the map on its side there to lay it out. And it identifies 195 shipwrecks on the map. But our team's been doing research in archives both in this country and Canada. And we now have period documentation on a total of 320 wrecks at Sable Island. So a well-deserved nickname of Graveyard of the Atlantic. The first wrecks occurring out there were the explorers, like Sir Humphrey Gilbert's Delight on his expedition to the New World. During the early years of the Mass Bay colony, you have immigrant vessels coming over like the Mary and Jane. She dropped off her immigrants, turns around to head back across the ocean, and ends up getting shipwrecked at desolate Sable Island. Curiously, the Captain John Rose was quite surprised to arrive and find 700 head of cattle on the island. And those, of course, were from the 1550 Portuguese visit, where they left a few cows that apparently did very well on Sable. The crew of the Mary Jane is on Sable for weeks, and what they're doing is finding parts of other shipwrecks and gathering them together, and they build themselves a shallop and sail that vessel 100 miles back to Nova Scotia. That was their way off the island. Moving a century later on in time, there's the Catherine, a snow that wrecked in 1737. It's still the Great Migration occurring. She came out of Ireland with 200 passengers on board, and 50%, 100 of them perished at Sable. And that tale makes it as front page news in all of the Boston papers, the wreck of the Catherine. And one of the people to read that about the wreck of the Catherine was our friend Andrew Lemercier, and caused him to create that relief establishment for 14 years on the island. Probably the most significant and lasting thing that Lemercier did is his crews brought horses to Sable Island. And when they left after 14 years, they left a small herd of horses on the island, and they continued there 2.5 centuries later. Those horses proved very helpful to some of the mariners that ended up there. In 1787, the George heads out on a 200-mile voyage from the island of Antigua on her way to St. John's in the US, what is now the US Virgin Islands. But she gets hit by a hurricane in late October and spends a month drifting slowly up the North Atlantic with her sails shredded, her spars down, and no control. A month later, they end up on the beach at Sable Island, wondering how they're going to get off there. Winter is setting in, they have no protection. They begin to consider cannibalism, but thankfully don't turn to it. And the solution they found was to dig pits and chase the horses into them so that they could have something to eat. So a very difficult life. The crew of the George is on Sable Island from late November until June, when they too, from the remnants of other shipwrecks, build themselves a small vessel to sail off to Nova Scotia. Into the 1800s, you now have that Humane establishment, so there's help on the island if you get shipwrecked. And the ships of every variety just keep on coming. Crofton Hall in 1898, where their back broken in the center. The steamer Skidby that drifted down the side of the island, caught on the sandy shoals. Greek freighter Platea, or the Boston trawler Gale in 1945, trapped on the Northeast Bar with sand piled up around her. But the wrecks begin to taper off. There's the Greek freighter Alpheos in 1946, rides up over 2 sandbars going at speed and is trapped in the shoals around the island, never to find her way out. The life-saving crews set up a breeches buoy to be able to get the people off the wreck across what were stormy seas at the time. So people begin to think that maybe this is all over with navigation aids. We aren't finding many more wrecks during the 1950s or 60s, but Sable proves she's never really done. There was the Euro Princess, a bulk carrier in 1981. She grounded on the Northeast Bar, took out her propellers and any means of propulsion. The storm then pushes her off the bar and she starts drifting directly for one of the drill rigs off of Sable. And if she hits it, she'll take the whole thing out. The Coast Guard starts evacuating all the crew off the drill rig and dropping them on Sable Island. Then they start taking people off of the Euro Princess itself. In the end, she drops an anchor and narrowly misses the rig by about 500 feet, but if the wind shifts, she'll take it out. Thankfully, that doesn't happen. And then something that hits home if you're a sailor today, we'll take a look at 1999 and the 41-foot sloop Merrimack left out of Newport bound for Europe and made a navigational error. Finds herself in the fog on the beach at Sable Island. And if you wonder what Sable does to any vessel, large or small, pretty quickly over a period of days, you can see the Merrimack and what happens to her, sinking into Sable sands. And when I was there in 2015, I took this photograph of one of her bulkheads and some of her rod rigging, pushed about 200 or 300 yards inland on Sable by storms over the years. So always a dull topic, but since we're there for archaeology, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes on it. So bear with me. It is the reason we're there, and we spend a lot of time with early charts trying to identify features of the island that are persistent through time, or places where there have been campsites or settlements or buildings on the island. The other thing we're looking for are features that if you were a shipwrecked sailor, you might want. We have to prioritize different areas that we want to explore. And Area E ends up being top on our list. And if we zoom in with an aerial shot, there are some high dunes that can help you if you're shipwrecked to look for other passing vessels. There are also some steep, shallow dunes that provide shelter from storms, and a small series of freshwater ponds that have been there for centuries, so a source of fresh water. And we end up using handheld GPS devices to map out transits across the area and map out our finds. Along with the cultural items we're really looking for, you find everything else on Sable, whether it's baleen plates from a whale, pilot whale skull, or perhaps the skull of a larger baleen whale. You can find navigational buoys that broke loose last year, or navigational buoys from 100 years ago. And everywhere in the sands being revealed and then covered up again are parts of vessels from the past. And offshore, the remains of a boiler from the Skidby that I showed you a little bit earlier. And other parts of vessels you find resting in the dunes. Eroding dunes are a source of a lot of cultural information. And we, inside them, in Area E, have found remains of an old building, brickwork, and a burned out floor. And we start collecting artifacts in that area, and each piece gives us a different clue looking into the past. An example might be this flint from a handgun or possibly a strike-a-light, probably dates to about 1725. Or this piece, which is a fragment of the bowl of a Cowlin clay pipe with a maker's mark on it, dating it to about 1690 to 1710. So back in the area more than 100 years before the Humane establishment was on island. And we have a sense that this may have been an area where there were the wreckers' dens and probably even earlier shipwreck evidence. We also find things like old flagstaff poles, probably from main station at headquarters, jutting out of a dune. And I'm going to take a moment just to explore what happens with dunes on Sable, some of the plants and wildlife of the island. A shot of a Quonset hut that I took back in 1987, and another view of it, this I took in 2015. And anything you build on Sable, the sand turns into a sand dune. It just starts to overtake it. A couple photographs of Humane establishment houses taken in the late 1960s give you a sense of what was happening. And actually, crews that worked on the island had to move from first floors to second floors of these buildings before they were abandoned. The island is covered with a lot of vegetation, the primary one being marram grass. That covers a good portion of the island, and in some places makes it feel very lush. There's the boat Tazarin in the background looking across the island. But you get things like beach peas and wild asters, beach roses, seaside goldenrod, wild cranberries growing, blueberries, false Solomon seal, wild strawberries. And all of this makes vegetation for the horses that still remain on the island. Pond lilies, the succulent sandwort, that's one of the first things to take over when new sand dunes become exposed. So in season, the island can be really beautiful during the summer months. There's bird life there. You have Arctic terns that stop in on their amazing migrations, picking small fish and amphipods from the ocean surface. Huge rookeries of herring gulls on the island. You have to be pretty careful where you walk, where you can step on an eggshell, on an egg, or even trot on an unfledged young gull. But by far the most special and unique of the birds is this tiny little fellow. This bird is called the Ipswich Sparrow, and it's named for Ipswich, Massachusetts, because that's where they were first described and found. And this tiny bird during the winter months you can find on the Atlantic seaboard from the Carolinas up to Maine. But what makes it really unique is that the only place these birds will build a nest, lay their eggs, and rear their young is on Sable Island. If Sable disappeared due to rising ocean levels, probably the Ipswich Sparrow would disappear as well. So remarkable small birds that make that hundreds of miles migration out into the Atlantic. A lot of seals at Sable, and there are 2 species. There's a small number, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 harbor seals. Those are the small seals that you sometimes will see around Mass Bay, around Cape Ann, especially in the winter months. But the really large seal colony on the island are gray seals. Quite a bit larger. These guys are, the females are about 600 pounds. The males weigh in at about 900 pounds. And over the last decade, the population of these seals has grown enormously. There were very few there 15 years ago. But now if you're on the island, you see clusters of them everywhere along the shore. And they've been growing and growing, the population. As you walk along one of the beaches, you can find dozens of them swimming offshore watching you. The harbor seals you can get right up close to. They're very curious. The gray seals are a bit more standoffish. When we were at the island in 2010, this population over 5 or 6 years had grown to 250,000 gray seals. When we were there in 2015, 5 years later, this population had grown closer to 500,000. They're just everywhere, especially in the winter months. They're all on island at the same time. And as I talk about the gray seals, it makes a little bit of a segue into the cod, which is why Gloucester fishermen were headed to the area. As many of you may be aware, up in Canada, the Atlantic cod had a huge collapse back in 1992. They thought it would come back quickly. After 10 years, it hadn't. After 20 years, it still hadn't. And then all of a sudden, there starts to be a little bit of recovery occurring. Many people were saying part of the problem were the gray seals at Sable. But in reality, it was when the gray seal population started to increase that the cod started to recover. And the scientists at Department of Fisheries and Oceans who've been looking at this have realized that actually the seal population eat a lot of forage fish like capelin and sand lance and herring that eat cod eggs. And with the cod population very small, the forage fish were eating all the eggs. But with gray seals starting to eat some of the forage fish, more of the eggs survive. So maybe it's an ecosystem actually getting more into balance. When Europeans first came over and settled this area, there were lots of cod and there were lots of seals coexisting. So by far the most famous aspect of the wildlife at Sable are these fellows, the feral or wild horses of the island that Le Mercier introduced. And they used to be used by the Humane establishment to ride patrols along the beaches during storms to look for shipwrecks. They'd hold roundups. They would tame some of the horses for their own use. Other horses they would take down to the beach and load them onto surf boats and take them out to a waiting ship to be transported to a horse auction in Halifax. And the proceeds of those auctions supported the Humane establishment to help keep saving sailors. But now for decades, it's been illegal to interfere with the horses in any way. You can neither help them nor hurt them. The population varies between about lows of maybe 200 to highs of about 350 individuals. And it's the harshness of the winter that changes the population size. But as I mentioned before, these horses are what saved some of the shipwrecked sailors on the island. They've come to know the island, they've adapted to it very well. They're recognized as their own breed, the Sable Island horse. They know how to live there. If a stallion with a band of mares needs water and they're not near a pond, the stallion will dig a well and then let everybody take turns drinking out of it. It's actually the same way sailors and fishermen wrecked there would get water. If you go to a low place on the island and dig a hole a foot or two deep, you get fresh water. So an iconic emblem that talks to the resilience of the island, and it's recognized throughout Canada, these horses. Beautiful animals. So now bringing our tale back to Gloucester again, and back to the fishermen that sailed out of Gloucester trying to feed a young and growing nation. And what I want to do is talk about a number of Gloucester vessels lost at Sable in those treacherous sands. And as I start that discussion, I'm going to start down at the man at the wheel on the boulevard and with a look at the Gloucester Fisherman's Memorial. Back in the early years of the fisheries, they were doing using hand lines off small schooners. They weren't using dories out there, but they'd take vessels like this to sail up to the banks around Sable. And curiously, if you look at the very first year listed at the Fisherman's Memorial of 1716, one of the names down near the bottom there is Daniel Stanley, the 23-year-old captain of one of the first vessels termed a schooner, and 6 of his crew. The vessel and all of the crew were lost at Sable Island. And the one at the top, William Botheen, had just married his new wife, Martha, before they left. And 8 months later, she would give birth to their child, Anna, who would have no father. And of course, that shows you the impact over the years on fishermen's wives and their families back in Gloucester. In 1722, another schooner goes down with loss of all hands. 1738, another schooner at Sable goes down. Around 1750, Joseph Allen and his crew are lost at Sable. The next spring, they would find the vessel ashore along with a body. Moving ahead about 100 years, we have more schooners wrecking at Sable. The Mohini was actually on a voyage back from the Gulf of St. Lawrence and wrecked. Her crew managed to survive. That's because now we have a humane establishment on island. Another way that we lose fishermen at Sable are dorymen lost at sea that go out to check their trawls but never return, lost in the fog or maybe capsized. We don't know. And one of the earliest records of that was off of the schooner Laura R. Burnham in 1871. 2 of her fishermen lost. Curiously, just 2 years later in 1873, the schooner herself would be lost at Sable. But the list of fishermen heading out on their dories who never return in the waters of Sable seems to just grow and grow over the years. Bit of a daunting list that keeps on going. And of course, in 1936, Adventure herself loses John Santos when his dory capsizes and he attempts to swim back to Adventure, but drowns. In 1876, the Daniel A. Burnham is trying to lay to in the shoals around Sable during a terrible storm. But when ocean waves and storms come into shallow water, the storms get taller, steeper, and break. The Daniel A. Burnham is rolled completely upside down, with the crew below falling from the cabin sole to the overhead and back again. She's dismasted and in serious trouble. She ends up drifting for a couple of days before she's spotted by a steamer. In 1894, the schooner Robert J. Edwards was on a voyage from Fortune Bay, Newfoundland, with a cargo of frozen herring headed back to Gloucester. But 5 weeks later, there's no word of her and everybody's worried. The answers about the Robert J. Edwards would end up coming by way of a bird. The schooner Mabel Layton was fishing on the banks, and out of the sky came a tired and beleaguered carrier pigeon that came down and landed on the deck of the Mabel Layton, and strapped to its leg was a message written by the superintendent working at the station on Sable. And the message read, Sable Island, 9:30 a.m., January 21st. American schooner Robert J. Edwards lost with all hands. South side, southwest hurricane, January 13th. Several days later, broken pieces of the Robert Edwards were drifting ashore, and her name board, which you can see in the top of this image inside one of their boathouses, was tacked to the rafters along with the names of so many other vessels that had wrecked. The Charles H. Taylor out of Gloucester in 1897. The vessel is lost, but the crew survives. First, they try launching dories to get to shore, and the first 5 of 8 dories are all smashed by waves on the side of the vessel. Finally, most of the crew make it ashore in 3 dories, but the rest of the crew are saved using breeches buoys from the island. In the coming days, the vessel would eventually drift closer to the island into the sands, and they'd start to salvage pieces off of her. The Mariner, schooner Mariner, is lost, but all hands survive. They take to their dories, and they have to row 18 miles to reach the island. And you get a sense of those sandbars and how long the tentacles reach out from Sable to threaten other ships. The Hattie E. Worcester in 1899. The vessel is lost, but all hands survive in this case as well. She was sailing back from the Strait of Belle Isle with 65,000 pounds of halibut. 10:30 at night in a heavy southwest breeze, she struck the northwest bar, breaking up. In thick fog, they take to the dories. 2 of the dories row 100 miles to the mainland of Nova Scotia. The 3 others are luckily found by the Coast Guard cutter Tampa days later. The Anglo-Saxon in 1900. The vessel is wrecked, but the crew survives. She tries to anchor in the shoals of Sable, but again, the ferocious waves in the shoals strip all of her deck gear, dories, sails, rigging, and spars get ripped off of her. She would eventually drift off of the sandbar and be drifting in the Atlantic, thankfully met by the steamer Corian, which gives them food and materials to build a jury rig. In 1900, the schooner Siegfried was lost with all hands. 18 children were born the loss of their fathers. 1901, the Iolanthe would be lost with all hands. 1902, the Annie Wesley lost with all hands. In 1904, the Lizzie M. Stanwood on a cold Valentine's Day in a blizzard, ends up sailing onto the bar. Excuse me. They do take to their dories and make it ashore to the lighthouse keeper's cottage. And now we get into some of the racing schooners of Gloucester, like the Esperanto that won the International Fisherman's Race in 1921. In 1920. A year later, in 1921, she's sailing along at about 9 knots off the south coast of Sable Island, when all of a sudden she's brought to an abrupt halt. And 15 minutes later, she's on the bottom. The cause of this was one of those times when the wrecks below lead to the wreck of another above. And back in 1879, the large steamer State of Virginia had wrecked at Sable Island and sunk in that spot. And Esperanto collided with the wreck. She went down very quickly because she was the pride of the fleet. Some salvage operations were attempted. She was raised 3 times, but each time managed to slip back down, and she's still resting there on the bottom beside the State of Virginia. There was Puritan in 1922, another racing schooner. And she was Gloucester's hope for that year's International Fishermen's Races. Had 22 men sailing on a halibut trip. Excuse me. The actual problem in this case was that Puritan sailed a bit faster than her captain realized. And he made a course adjustment to pass to the other side of Sable. But indeed, she was so fast that she'd already come abreast of the bars. So in the end, she ends up piling up onto the sandbar. It's thick fog. One stack of dories is smashed, but they take to the other dories. One of those dories capsizes and Chris Johnson drowns, but thankfully, all of the rest of them are saved. Here's a group of them that did make it to Sable, and another group rescued by the Coast Guard. The Maréchal Foch in 1922. The vessel was lost, but the crew survives. Some of them rode all the way to Nova Scotia in their dories. And then there's Columbia, 1927, another one of the racing schooners. And in this case, it's an event known as the August Gales. It was a ferocious event. Terrible storms seemed to strike the waters around Sable in August. The Halifax Herald reported on it, a headline of over 80 lives lost in great disaster, treacherous graveyard of the Atlantic. The port of Lunenburg had lost 4 schooners, the Clayton Walters, the Joyce Smith, the Mahala, and the Uta Corkum. But sadly, added to that was going to be Columbia as well. And the only remains of her that were found were a pair of oars and 2 of her dories with Columbia's name on them that washed ashore on Sable. And now we'll step up into our own time frame. A satellite view of the Western North Atlantic. This is November 1st, 1991, a day most of us probably remember well. It was a day that brought furious waves into Cape Ann. It turned Eastern Point into an island for a period of time. It was the perfect storm, and sadly would be the end of some other fishing. The Andrea Gale had been out on a sword fishing trip to the Grand Banks and was trying to make her way home through the terrible weather. It turns out that her last communication, the little red star on the far right of the screen, was when she radioed the Hannah Bowden, gave her position, and if you look at what her Great Circle course was going to be to head home to Gloucester, it takes her just south of Sable Island. At the time, she was reporting 30-foot seas and 50 to 80 knot winds. It turns out that weather buoys in the area around Sable recorded 60-foot seas and 100 knot winds. We don't know exactly where the Andrea Gale went down, but what we do know is that search teams on Sable a few days later found the Andrea Gale's emergency position beacon, a propane tank from her, and also one of her fishing net locator beacons. So it could be that Sable Island played a role in the fate of the Andrea Gale as well. And I just want to take a moment. I tried to compile a list of people on Gloucester vessels whose final resting place is Sable Island. And I'm just going to let this quietly scroll across the screen for a moment. My list, I think, has about 127 fishermen on it. But what I also want to think about is adventure today. And one of the really wonderful things that Adventure does is each year she holds a couple of descendant sales for family members who are descendants of the fishermen of Gloucester who sailed out on these vessels. Some of them never came back. Most of them thankfully did. And those descendant sales are a really magical time for the people who get to come aboard Adventure for them. And we're always looking to hopefully grow those descendant sales and find more people who it can be a meaningful experience for. So wrapping things up, I hope you'll spend a little bit of time this evening thinking about Sable, maybe thinking about the wildlife there, the balance of ecosystems at the island. It's really an amazing spot. And I also hope you'll think about the vessels lost there, but also the amazing people working on island to save lives, an unending task. And of course, the fishermen out of Gloucester, working in their bank stories, trying to feed a growing nation and feed the world, especially at a time when Gloucester's harbor was just filled with schooners. And I also want to just say that another great thing Adventure does is they bring all of this story to groups of young youth through the education programs there, letting them learn about our past, learn some science, deal with health of the oceans and the fisheries. So wrapping up, it's always time once again to leave Sable, get back aboard the boat, start sailing for home, heading for the sun setting in the west, and astern over Sable Island, looking back to see the moon rising over the dunes. So I thank you all, and I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you have some questions, I think JJ is ready to take over.
I've got
Great.
one, Bob.
Thank you, Bill. That was wonderful. And I hope everybody enjoyed this as much as I did. Before we take some questions, I think I'm hoping if Peter Souza will unmute, he can give us a little bit on the musical Captain Circle event that he and Audie are going to be putting on in December.
Good evening, everyone. That was awesome, Bill. Nice job on that.
Thanks, Peter.
Audie and I will be doing some sea shanties and sea songs on December 17th. We'll be doing some history on the shanties itself and some of the meanings. And basically, they were only used for 100 years from about 1820 up to 1920. We're also going to intertwine that with some other sea songs and fishing songs that we've done on a regular basis. And hopefully we'll see everybody then on the 17th. So join in when we're going to have a fun evening. And thank you all for being here tonight, too. This was wonderful, Bill.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Peter. And before we take some questions, just another quick reminder that our annual appeal is underway. You should have received a mailing by now. And if you didn't, please think about making a donation online through our website, which is schooneradventure.org, or by calling either Betsy Hoffman or Stephanie Edick directly. I know that this time of year, most of you must feel like you have a target on your backs from all the appeals that you get, but we really do truly appreciate your financial support, and hope that you will either join or maintain your standing in our captain circle. And so thank you again for that. Now, who has a question for Bill?
I do, JJ. So Bill, it's Walter. When are you going back?
Hi, Walter.
Hi.
I'm not sure when I will go back there. Actually, what I'm planning to do next is I hope to sail up to Newfoundland and Labrador, back up to some Inuit settlements that I visited long ago up there. But at some point, I'll get back to Sable.
Well, that sounds like a great alternative adventure. Yeah.
It sounds like a definite maybe. Do you have to have a permit to sail there?
You do have to get permission, and now it's through Parks Canada. If you want to go to the island, you have to deal with them. They have also, more recently, they feel pressure to try and get people there. So they've been working with a expedition cruise company that takes small vessels out. So that's one way to get to the island. The other way to do it is there is an aircraft that's licensed to fly out there. They use it to supply the station today and swap the Parks Canada people in and out. But it's an expensive way to get to Sable. It's a special small short takeoff and landing aircraft that can land in the soft sand, has special wheels.
Oh, wow.
But it's a very expensive proposition.
How about climate change, Bill? What is do you worry about sea level rise for Sable Island?
Yeah, so it's a big worry for Sable, with so much of the island being low-lying. And really, if you look back, all of those banks, from George's Bank, Bankero, Sable Bank, all the way up to the Grand Banks, it's really one huge, long, terminal glacial moraine from the Wisconsin Ice Age. The ice sheet came down over North America, pushing debris in front of it, plowed out over the continental shelf, and left these huge sand deposits. 7,000 years ago, when more water was tied up in ice, there were probably more islands out there. Maybe that's why the Ipswich Sparrow is there today. It was easier to find. But over time, sea levels have risen. They've been stable for a while, but now seem to be increasing again. Sable is so low that it is threatened by it. And the real question is whether sea level is going to threaten the island. I don't think we have the answers, but it's a huge concern.
Thanks.
I also see there's a question from Greg Bover about, do I know why the gray seal population grew so much? And I don't think we have answers to that. I'm not aware of why it is. It was really just an exponential growth. And we don't have a lot of data on what the sort of virgin population of those animals was before sealing took place. But certainly they've expanded very, very quickly and is now the largest population in the world.
Are they seeing the sharks there the same way they're seeing them off the Cape?
Yes, actually there are a lot of sharks at Sable. And the water being cold is one reason why you might not swim, but the real reason are the sharks. I think there are about 10 different species of sharks around the island. And one of the predators that's moved in is what's called the Greenland shark. It's a very big, very slow moving shark, very slow metabolism, and one of the longest lived creatures on Earth. And they think that they have found that seal population. It's a more sort of a phagophilic, cold water loving shark that has migrated down to Sable and is preying on that gray seal population. But the sharks don't seem to put a dent in it. You do see seal carcasses on the beach with big hunks out of them and stuff as you walk around. We've even seen shark attacks of them in the waters as we're moving along the beach. But there are a lot of sharks around Sable.
Hey, Bill, Tom Ellis here. You said that anchoring is like just anchoring off on the lee shore. Why don't you go around on the other side of the island?
The reason we don't go to the other side,
So I assume that's the northwest side, the more direct
Yeah,
side.
the smile kind of
Halifax.
runs east-west. So there's a north side and a south side to the island. And there are a couple reasons. If you sail out from Nova Scotia, if you want to get to the south side of Sable, it's going to add another 60 miles,
Right.
which is a lot of time because you have to go not just around the end of the island, but all the way around the bars. But the big problem is that the south side of the island is almost always impossible to land on. The surf is so rough on the side that faces out into the open Atlantic.
And so what do you use to land? Do you just, does a standard dinghy work?
Yeah, so I actually had some, my talk was too long, it probably still was. I took out some images of landings. Landing is tricky. In 2010, we were using a Zodiac to land, and it's one thing to get ashore and maybe get flipped around and tossed in the surf. In 2010, we got ashore. It was before Parks Canada was there. And at the end of the first day of archaeological work, we made about 5 attempts to launch the dinghy and get back off the island, but it literally would just get thrown right up over our heads and we'd get dumped out. And that happens 4 or 5 times, and you keep seeing the shark attacks on seals, and you say, well, we'll wait for another day. But we use a Zodiac to get on and off the island. Usually it's doable, but the north side is almost always calmer.
So it's not like having a yacht club launch come and greet you.
No, it's on a good day, it can be difficult, and on a bad day, it can really be
It's
tough.
a no-go.
Yeah, actually, in 2010, when the Coast Guard was managing the island, we couldn't stay on island with them, so we had to try and get back aboard the boat. It turned out that in one of the old keepers' cottages, there were some graduate students doing botany work, and we ended up camping out with them for a night. We always keep some people aboard the boat at night, just in case the weather turns, because it's a place you want to be able to get your boat out of quickly. And so they'll even cut an anchor road and flee, leaving some of us on the island versus bad weather coming in and having your boat there.
Right. Thank you.
Wow. I'm looking. Anyone else?
Hey, Bill, are any of the wild horses tamed or trained to ride?
No, they used to do that back in the era of the Humane establishment. They'd have them as workhorses and they would ride patrols. But since the 1960s, it is illegal to do anything with those horses. They are not scared of people in general. I've been bending over during archaeological work and felt a nudge on my behind, and you think it's going to be one of the team. And
Really?
you're one of our team, and you turn around and it's a mare, and it reaches out and it puts his mouth right around your thigh and squeezes gently to see what you're about. You kind of wonder, but what are you going to do? Outrun it? So you just quietly start walking away. Some of the stallions can be put offish. It's mares and some of the young colts and fillies that are more curious, but the stallions can be kind of protective of their bands of mares.
And there are none of the cattle left?
None of the cattle, after John Rose wrecked in the Mary and Jane, he was actually, they built their little boat, they sailed to Nova Scotia. The French that were there, when they heard about the cattle, they forced him to get in a boat with them and sail back to Sable Island so that they could start harvesting the cattle. And within 20 years, they were all gone. Yeah. Let's see, I'm trying to see if we have anything else.
Is it a question from Elizabeth? Are there any other birds or migratory creatures which land there that you didn't touch on?
Yeah, actually there are a lot of incident birds that occur at Sable. And I hate to admit, I'm much better at kind of seabirds than I am at some of the migratory species that stop in there. But they get a lot of different bird life. They have ended up with an eagle on island. A few times they've had snowy owls on the island. So different ones end up there. Some of them I think are blown off course. Some of them are passing through. I've seen curlews on the island. So you do get a variety of bird life out there.
What
Is
about
there,
pollinators, Bill?
is there a way to document that?
The bird life?
Yes.
Yes, actually, there are researchers that keep field lists of what does occur there. And I'm sorry, I don't have that, but I know people that do track that. There's a lot of biological research that takes place on the island. We happen to be the only team that was doing cultural history research. But for a number of years, there's been a lot of biological research on the horses, the seals, the plant life, the bird life.
Thank you.
And pollinators, Bill, are there, I saw there's asters and all sorts of flowers, so I assume there's somebody out there.
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of different pollinators and insects. Curiously, one of them is the Sable Island sweat bee. It's a very small bee, and it is endemic to only Sable Island and found nowhere else.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
You're not going to find a trove of honey, though.
No big troves of honey, I don't think.
And Bill, Elizabeth had another question. Do you pitch tents when you stay overnight, or is there a bio station?
There is the Lightkeeper's Cottage that we managed to spend the night in back in 2010. Like most old structures on the island, is now condemned. And in 2015, when Parks Canada had taken over, they were really much easier to work with than Coast Guard Canada. And so Parks Canada has been very supportive. They have put money into supporting us, and they have given us berths at main station. So we've been able to keep some of our group ashore, which lets us get more work done instead of getting back aboard the vessel each night. And they do house other researchers who come out to the island, but generally not in tents. They're usually at the station.
We have a question from Peter Madsen. Bill, have you been able to find any human remains that you've been able to trace back to any specific ship?
No, we actually haven't encountered any human remains ourselves. People that have worked on the island over the past 20 or 30 years, I actually have a few photographs some of them have taken of gravestones on Sable. But those gravestones have once again been buried and are gone. It's one of the curious things about Sable. You get a storm that comes through and it unearths something. In some cases, a gravestone. In some cases, wooden barrels filled with stuff. Or there's another time when a huge storm took off the side of a dune and revealed a shipwreck survivor camp from 100 years earlier, a naval vessel, naval transport. But then another storm comes along and it's gone. It's a really tricky environment for archaeology with everything shifting and moving. I see a question, are there any First Peoples artifacts? So that's a really fascinating question. First Peoples, First Nations. And Sable Island today, since Parks Canada took it over in 2013, and our team was invited as the only non-Canadians to write a letter to the commission that was trying to decide who would manage Sable. I wrote a letter in support of Parks Canada because they have an interest in, the environment and cultural history and education. And in the end, Parks Canada got control of the island. I got a nice thank you from one of their directors for my letter. But the question of First Nations. So right now, Sable Island is not a national park. Technically, it is a national park reserve. And the term reserve means that there is a First Nations claim to the island that is unresolved. And if they resolve it, the term reserve would go away. But if it stays there, it will continue to be called a reserve. There are ongoing negotiations about that. There was one person who said that they had found an arrowhead on island, but the reports are not really solid. The curious thing is that I don't think intentionally in the last 1,000 years that native peoples made it to Sable and back. They just didn't really have the craft to be able to do that kind of thing on an intentional basis. But what I mentioned about if you look back in more geological time to 10,000 years ago, it is quite possible that with Sable Island being many, many times larger at that time, that you may have had traffic going back and forth between Nova Scotia and the area around Sable Island. So it's still an unresolved issue, but one that the Canadians are looking into, and they tend to be a federal government that's, welcomes that dialogue. So.
And Bill Whitney was asking if what you used as a source for your weather forecasting.
We're typically relying on Environment Canada for our forecasts. We get them a few different ways out there. You can't get VHF weather radio that we get around here, or you get along the Nova Scotian coast. You're too far offshore. So we're getting it using a satellite phone for data downloads. You can also get some through single sideband, but it's Environment Canada is what we really rely on for the weather data.
Interesting.
It's just on the weather topic. For over 100 years, there was a weather station on Sable, and it just closed about 1.5 years ago. Environment Canada decided they couldn't fund it anymore, but it was an intriguing stable oceanic point of weather data for over a century. And they would twice a day launch weather balloons at Sable Island, twice a day around the world at the same moment in time. There are something like 700 stations around the globe that release weather balloons, all at the same moment. Those float up through the atmosphere with aerosons on them that are recording air pressure and temperature, wind velocities. And all that data is fed into the most powerful computers in the world, supercomputers that do weather modeling. So sadly now, as of 1.5 years ago, the data point at Sable's gone.
Jan Walker asked, why no lighthouses anymore out there?
Lighthouses. So, they had lighthouses at both ends of the island. They built them near the ends of the island early on and then had to move them further in towards the center of the island because they would get the land around them got eaten away and the towers would fall. So over time, I think there've been something like 7 lighthouses built on Sable. Wow. The last 2 lights, east and west, the east tower that was really just a metal tower going up was extinguished probably 15 years ago and is now, the sands and wind have made it fall, it's gone. The last west light, which isn't too far from main station, the tower still is there, but it just has a little red flasher for aircraft on it. It was extinguished, I don't know, I think maybe 12, 15 years ago also. And it was other forms of electronic navigation that they decided it's too expensive to maintain and keep those lit. There's some question as to whether the lighthouses ever really helped keep ships off of Sable Island, though. They didn't seem to decrease the number of wrecks even in the 1800s and 1900s once they put them up.
Sorry. Do they have a weather station there now?
The weather, there's no more weather staff on island, but they do have there are weather instruments that record data and send it to the mainland, but they don't get that mapping of the atmosphere over the island anymore. So they still collect some data at Sable digitally, yes.
Any other questions?
How can we help Sable Island?
How can you help Sable? Yeah, there are a couple ways to do it. There's a group called Friends of Sable Island up in Canada, and they support a lot of research. They do on island. They're kind of a friends group to Parks Canada. They have friends groups for some of their parks, just like we do in the United States. You can probably find them online, Friends of Sable Island. And there's another more kind of research-based organization called Sable Island Institute up in Nova Scotia as well. And they are trying to do a lot of formal research on island. So those are two groups.
And are they not-for-profits?
They are both not-for-profits. Keep in mind, if you're an American and give to a Canadian nonprofit, it's not tax deductible.
Okay.
I actually give to them myself a little bit because I care about the island, but yeah, they're nonprofits for Canadians.
Yep.
Here's a question, an interesting question about the salvagers. Do you think they were doing the same thing as they did on Bermuda and I think down in Nags Head, North Carolina, where they were actually trying to attract ships?
Yeah,
on the island?
it's curious. Nags Head, I don't know if any of you know why it's called Nags Head, but the reason is down there that wreckers would hang lanterns under an old horse, a nag, and they would send the horse out to wander the beaches of Nags Head at night to try and confuse shipping. That's why I used to have a t-shirt that had a horse with a lantern on it that said Nags Head. Yeah. We don't have any evidence. We haven't heard a tale of somebody trying to lure them in with lights at Sable. We do know they were there, but we haven't heard or read any reports that they were actively trying to confuse them.
There were enough wrecks that they didn't need the extra work.
Yeah, it was enough wrecks. Yeah.
All right. And Jan Walker made a comment that some Canadian nonprofits have an American arm to make it tax deductible. So you can look into that if you're interested in helping out Sable Island that way. Any other questions or comments?
I'm happy if later any of you want to reach out to me by email or something. I'm sure Betsy can put you in touch with me. We also did create a 45-minute documentary film. If you're interested in seeing that online, I can probably, through Betsy, arrange that if she doesn't yell at me. But anyways.
And
I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great presentation and, great.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you. I could tell you're passionate about it.
Yeah, I am.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Bill.
Bob.
Nice.
Thank you, Bill.
Very nice. And thanks to everybody for coming in and listening in and socializing and being here. And we're happy to see you and hope you're all being safe out there.
Thank you. That was spectacular.
It's a really wonderful talk.
Thank you.